Welcome to the first quarterly ethics review brought to you by the Institute for Enterprise Ethics at the Daniels College of Business here on the University of Denver campus. In this first review, we're going to talk about the scandal resulting from the General Motors ignition switch recalls. We're going to talk about the patient waiting list issue from the Veterans Administration. We're going to talk about the effects of high income and wealth disparity on the social fabric of our country. And then we're going to wind up with some rapid fire, quick hit responses to some other issues. Cindy, the Veterans Administration patient waitlist scandal cost General Shinseki his job, and it certainly cost thousands of veterans untold pain, both physically and psychologically. What caused this? Was this simply another governmental bureaucratic foul-up, or was there something more sinister below it?
That's a good question, Dan. It's actually, I think, a little bit of both. On the bureaucratic side, there's no doubt that we're talking about a very large public sector organization. There is a lot of people, there's a lot of bureaucracy and process. In the Clinton administration, President Clinton appointed someone who came in and cleared house and streamlined practices and got the VA operating very effectively, but as of late, those advancements have seemed to decline. It is very much part of the history of this organization, though, that there are troubles here. Back in 1921, when President Harding appointed the first director of the VA, the story goes that somebody came into the White House and found President Harding with his hands around the director's throat, trying to choke him to death because he had been accepting bribes and was a corrupt leader. So this is part of the history of this organization. In a bureaucratic organization, a public sector organization, accountability just isn't the same as it can be in a private sector organization. And that accountability is lacking for two very good reasons. One reason is the civil service system, which regulates who can be hired into the system, and more than that, regulates who can be exited from the system. It becomes very difficult to discipline or terminate an employee in the public sector. On the other hand, who are the people who are non-civil servants in the government? They're the political appointees. And what happens with the political appointees? Well, they come and go as the administration changes. So we have people on the bottom of the organization that can't be held accountable, and we have people at the top of the organization that can't be held accountable. And so it does become a difficult situation. Don McCubbery and I studied this a bit here in the state of Colorado as we investigated the problems in enacting some IT system changes. And they were complete and utter failures. And we asked that same question: would this have happened in the private sector, or is it the lack of accountability in the public sector? So I think the bureaucracy helps us understand that. But there's also no doubt whatsoever that there's a corrosive culture. In fact, that's the term that's being used now to describe the culture. It's corrosive. That there's a lot of finger pointing and blaming, and bad news doesn't go forward. It's suppressed. I read that fully 25% of all federal whistleblowing cases that are being heard right now come from the VA. So it appears as if there are some serious cultural issues. On top of that, they had been using a metric to measure performance and also give bonuses to their employees. And this metric becomes the heart of this case. It's the metric that all patients would need to be seen within 14 days. Unfortunately, the software could be gamed, and it was. The employees would wipe it out and put in a different date, which actually advanced the system another 14 days. And this is what resulted in the long waits. And so at the same time, these veterans are not receiving the care they deserve. The people who are doing this are receiving bonuses for their excellent performance. It's ironic.
Yeah. Yes. John?
Yes, Cindy, you talk about the whistleblowing cases. Reportedly, a lot of those whistleblowers also were the victims of retaliation, I guess consistent with the corrosive culture that you mentioned. How do we correct that kind of culture of retaliation? Is there any way to get a grip on that, absent perhaps just privatizing the whole thing and giving up and giving the veterans vouchers to go out and get quality care in the private sector?
You know, that's a tempting solution, John, but it actually brings up a very interesting point in this case, which is that once a veteran receives care, he or she reports an 80% satisfaction level with the care he or she has received. So as one veteran put it, either we get seen in 30 days and get cured, or we die because we haven't been seen. So the subsequent care is great. It's just the access to the care that seems to be broken in this point. And so do we blow up everything because one piece of it is broken, or do we try to fix the broken piece? That's a very important question. Overall, though, the issue of can you change a culture in this kind of situation is really a difficult question. You might ask yourself, what would happen in the private sector? Well, Mary Barra fired a number of people. Can people be fired in this situation? I thought one of the most outrageous things here was that supervisors were training new hires on how to fudge the system. And so when you have something that's as broken as that, I think it'd be awfully hard to fix it. The government has produced a report about what are the problems and what should be fixed. And I think they know the problems, but the fixes they suggest are pretty weak.
Cindy, I would suggest that the veteran is more important than the system that serves them, right? It would appear to me that if the Veterans Administration fundamentally is not able to handle the veteran load that it has responsibility for, that the agency would permit itself to give the veteran the opportunity to take their medical care somewhere else if they couldn't satisfy that need within some specified time frame, like 14 days or 30 days. That way, the veteran would at least have an opportunity to be seen, and as we know, what gets measured is what gets done, and if you're not doing it, you're going to fudge it. That takes away the fudge factor. I know the solutions are hard, but I think it can be managed with good leadership, and I appreciate the summary that you gave us on that issue. Thank you.
You know, the situation is really a sad one because we're talking about people that have served our country without question and have received such an inappropriate response to that. And you might wonder if this would be the case if we were talking about health care access for members of Congress or their families. You know, back a few years ago when Denver International Airport opened, they had a very famous problem with the baggage system. And the mayor shut down the airport and said, we are not opening this until this system is fixed. And they spent a great deal of money to get that system fixed. Right. Why can't we get systems for the disadvantaged fixed? Is it because they don't have the same voice? I think that's a question we have to ask.
Great, thank you.
That's a substantial point to finish this conversation on. Thank you very much. John, let's talk about this General Motors ignition switch issue. It seems to me that by now General Motors has recalled almost every car they've manufactured this year. And they've also admitted some responsibility for the deaths of 23 people related to this ignition switch issue. What was the underlying cause of this mess?
You're certainly right, Dan. It's been a huge number, 30 million vehicles recalled. In terms of taking responsibility, they have taken some responsibility for the deaths and injuries. They would have suffered some significant reputational damage had they not done so. But they have gone the low road and fought legally on the property value issue and the loss of value of the vehicles. So they're going to fight those out because they very cleverly inserted in the bankruptcy agreement that they would experience no successor liability when they went from the old GM to the new GM, and most of the problems happened under the old GM. In terms of the causes of all this are really multiple. You've got, first of all, pure negligence on the part of some employees, a product design manager, who, without telling anybody, including superiors or other drivers, that he had replaced what he found out was a faulty ignition switch in 2006, even though everybody knew about it, or a lot of people knew about it going back as far as 2001. But the problem is when you don't disclose it to the drivers, there's a lot of people out there driving with faulty ignition switches. So that's one of the causes. Another real cause is the culture within GM, which was sort of a don't send the bad news upward. We don't want to hear about it. The GM nod was at work, as they say, which was acknowledging, yes, everything is fine and we don't want to hear about anything else. And the GM wave, which was we want to point the blame at others, it's not our fault. And that goes back historically in the GM culture. So there's a lot of cultural problems, and as contrasted to Ford Motor Company, where Alan Mulally, the former CEO, invited bad news. He wanted to hear that, and he in fact directly applauded a manager after taking over as CEO, and they got the news that he was going to behave differently and wanted to hear the bad news. So he rewarded people for coming forward with mistakes, knowing that mistakes are inevitable, rather than trying to bury them under the rug.
So John, I'm wondering, how does a corporation like a GM get to the point where it appears that there's a lack of accountability and also a lack of a sense of social responsibility, and that those two things take a back seat to profitability? How do they get there?
Yes. Unfortunately, George, I think it was embedded in the culture way before this controversy exploded on GM. And it goes back to what brought about the bankruptcy in the first place. Of course, you know, Ford, the contrast I made there, Ford never went into bankruptcy, never took a bailout. Because they didn't have to. GM needed to, but they did so by blaming others, that it was either the exorbitant pension fund, it was the fault of the unions, it was the fault of high gas prices. It wasn't their fault for having very poor engineering or very poor product line choices, which later turned out really to be the case. That the ironic thing is that while they've taken a hit in terms of their stock value, consumers keep buying the automobiles. They come in and bring their recalled vehicles in, and when they're in the showroom, they look around and then buy a new car. It's very strange, and it says something about consumer behavior, I guess. But I think you're right that these sorts of things don't happen suddenly. They occur over time.
So, John, how do you think Mary Barra, the CEO of a year's tenure, is handling all this situation?
All in all, she's acquitted herself quite well, especially in distinction to Tony Hayward at BP and some of the other CEOs caught up in crises. She was very critical of GM in her congressional testimony. She authorized an internal investigation by a former major U.S. attorney, Anton Voluska, and his report came through also with scathing critique. And so she authorized a lot of good stuff going on internally, and meanwhile fired 15 top managers including 2 out of the legal department who were in charge of product liability and securities litigation. And then she also fired the director of regulatory affairs. So there were people who weren't doing their job. I think it was also, partially reinforced by the bad culture. So she took those positive steps, and now she's also hired a global safety director and set up a mechanism to try and prevent this. It's a very bad comment on GM that they never had such an office in the first place and such a system in place. I think that she's not satisfied all her critics. Congress is still saying, you should have more heads rolling. But all in all, I think she's almost gotten gold stars for her performance.
John, we've heard this before from a CEO. I never knew this was happening. Nobody ever told me. Do you think that's a plausible response on the part of a CEO, that I didn't know that this was happening?
It's really sad. I think it's plausible that it could happen in a large organization, but it does not speak well, of course, Cindy, to the quality and competence of the top CEO. In her case, she was new, so she wasn't in a position to be receiving the bad news. But it's really a terrible comment that they didn't have somebody they could rely on within the organization to bring them the bad news. It's the old groupthink yes man or yes person culture that don't want to hear the bad news, and too many organizations behave that way. So I guess my answer would be, unfortunately, it is plausible. And maybe that says we shouldn't have such large bureaucratic organizations, either in the business community or in the public sector.
And I think, Cindy, we will probably hear it again in the future.
I think we will.
Thank you. Very good analysis. Keen insights. George, the Federal Reserve System recently reported that since the year 2000, household wealth in the United States has increased by $37 trillion. They also reported that all of that wealth went to the top 3% of income earners.
Right.
The next 7% kind of held steady, and the bottom 90% steadily declined.
Right.
Now, clearly, this isn't a fair distribution. But in a free market society, who's to blame? What does one do about this situation?
Yeah, it's a great question, Dan. I think it's a very simple question to a very complex problem, right? Fundamentally, who's responsible? There's really no one person responsible. And is it fair? When you ask that question of fairness, you assume that someone's in charge and have made a decision about this or that, when in fact that's not the case either. There's no one person responsible, and there's no one person or entity that has made a decision with respect to this income inequality issue. I think if we were going to point our finger at a big target, we would have to say democratic capitalism may be at fault. In that within that system, you and I have the opportunity to satisfy our own self-interest as we pursue the satisfaction of our needs and wants. And given our capabilities, fundamentally as a function of our education and our learning and experience, we can take advantage of that system, again, given those capabilities. There are some issues that create what we might describe as a lack of a level playing field, where society members don't have access to the education that they need to pursue their dreams. They don't have the economic capability because they are on the lower end of that economic spectrum, and education, as we all know, continues to get higher, meaning cost more to get in a decent school to get the education that you need. I think another contributing factor with respect to income inequality is that there's been a significant change in the tax structure within the United States. Back in a prior administration, I'll just say it was the Bush administration, recent tax changes that were done at that time transferred $2 trillion to the upper members of our society with respect to income and wealth. Where did that money go for the other folks that are continuing to decline? They didn't see those advantages because they didn't have the investments and the other instruments that would allow them to do that. I think another contributing factor with respect to income inequality is that those who are in a position to leverage their closeness to the process of market capitalism are able to do so in a way that advantages them and their descendants, that those on the other end of the economic spectrum don't have. For example, a hedge fund manager on Wall Street can make on average $1 billion a year. 3 years ago, a key hedge fund manager, who I won't name, made $10 billion a year. Those who are closest to the practice of democratic capitalism and can influence that process are in a position to gain the most from it. Those on the opposite end of the spectrum are not.
Yes, focusing on solutions, if there are any, George. You can either raise the bottom or lower the top. In terms of raising the bottom, we've had quite a rush to expand the minimum wage in various cities in the federal government. Given that the studies seem to be mixed on the overall result, even the Congressional Budget Office finding that it might price certain marginal workers out of the employment market at all, how can we really go after raising the bottom and on terms of lowering the top? Is there any fair way to try and correct the excesses, whether it be hedge fund managers or others? What are the practical solutions, if any?
Well, that's a great question, John. I think it's a tough call. The Harvard University did a study and asked the average American consumer what the difference is on average between their compensation and their CEOs, for example. And they guessed 30 times, and that's not correct. It's actually 354 times. And they asked the question, what's a fair ratio? They said 7 to 1, right? The respondents to the survey said 7 to 1. If indeed it was a 7 to 1 ratio, the average worker in the United States today would have to make $1.8 million in order to have that ratio be real. So fundamentally, I don't think raising the minimum wage is going to have an effect on closing that gap and getting that ratio to 7 to 1, because no one's going to pay an entry-level employee $1.8 million a year. Nor do I think taxing those who are at the top of the wealth spectrum is going to be the answer either. I think, as I mentioned in my earlier comments, that a major contributing factor to individuals' capabilities to improve themselves, simply in the context of wealth, is allowing them to have access to higher education. Because the technology and the means and methods with which we conduct business in this country today have left a vast number of our citizens out of the game. And unless they can somehow figure out how to acquire those technical and education skills, raising the minimum wage will always still be the minimum wage.
Thank you.
You know, George, if motivation theory is applied here, you'd say that people want to aspire to be in that top percent. And if there's no motivation for me to work hard to get into that top percent, and I just expect somebody to hand me something that I didn't work for, that nobody is going to prosper. Do you think that's really the issue?
Actually, I don't. I think that this is huge. A cultural norm that exists in the world of the underprivileged is that, and this is not as they would phrase it, the system is as it is, and I can't change it, therefore, why try? The truth of the matter is, it's a different world than their environment allows them to see. And I think everyone who has a capability to do anything, if given the right opportunity and the right motivation from family members, from support groups, from non-governmental agencies, from friends and neighbors, that encourages them to take advantage of what's there, assuming it's there, to better themselves, that they indeed will. I don't think it's a lack of motivation. I don't think it's a situation where you say, you know, certain members of our society are just lazy, and therefore no matter what you do for them, it won't matter because they don't have the chutzpah to go get it and make it happen. I believe that's not true.
You know, this is an issue that I think if we take the time, we'll have more opportunity to talk about, and I hope we can do that. Thanks. Thank you very much. Okay, colleagues, we're going to do 3 quick hit questions here. So 1-liners or 2-liners at most, right? The first one is the NFL and off-field violence. Now, my question is, why has this, basically an employment issue, gone to the senior guy in the league rather than being handled as any other employment issue would by the owner of the company that employs him? Cindy?
Well, my take on this is that the football players are members of a labor union, and they're covered by a collective bargaining agreement. And so the adjudication process for things like this takes a different route.
John?
I think it's really falling in the bailiwick of both, that there are owners that are simply giving up these players, letting them go, but I think at the same time the NFL commissioner is the most visible person, and obviously the owners pick the NFL commissioner, so he becomes a lightning rod, and then from there everything trickles back down to the owners.
George?
Yeah, I think it's an easy answer in that the NFL is a corporation and its image is at stake. And they're not going to let the guy down on the shop floor make a decision that could embarrass the company, the NFL.
Well, I would wish I was on that panel because I got a different point of view. All right, thanks. Okay, number 2, the tax inversion issue. This is when a company, either through an acquisition or otherwise, changes its headquarters, and one of the effects of that is to lower its corporate income tax, right? So this idea of a company relocating headquarters to another company is often termed unpatriotic, but it's not illegal. And the question is it unethical? Is it now unethical to be unpatriotic? Or is it just bad form? George?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely unethical, and it probably raises itself to the level of being unpatriotic as well. Because although those corporations do an administrative tap dance and assign responsibility to an offshore organization as its headquarters, it still expects to be protected by the United States and everything that the United States offers, not only by the way of defense protection, but also the maintenance of this thing called free market capitalism, which allows them to survive. It's not fair to take from anything and give nothing back.
John?
I'll go down the opposite road. I think it's neither unpatriotic nor is it unethical because they're responding to systemic incentives. If there's a disparity in the corporate tax rates worldwide, and it's very low in Ireland, and it's the highest possible here in the US at 35 to 39%, then I think we have to change the incentives. So they're simply responding to systemic issues here, and they are propelled by them.
Cindy?
Well, it's funny how the system creates opportunities for some people in society, some groups in society to prosper, but others can't take advantage of these same opportunities. Some of our citizens might like to be able to get the benefits that accrue to you from being in other countries as well, but we don't get those either. So, you know, here we have another example of how the rules differ for the well-off versus the underprivileged.
So you're joining George and you're going to gang up on John.
I'm joining George and ganging up on John.
Let me add another comment, right? of the Fortune 500, and I'll safely say the top 25 firms within that Fortune 500 paid an effective tax rate of 0.
Yes.
And so consequently, you don't need to leave this country if you have the talent within your company to effectively manage your tax obligations.
True.
Let me add another thought. As a loyal American, that I will remain so because, as contrasted to Australia, I would never emigrate to that high tax region. So I'm responding to incentives as well.
Well, and ironically, responding to incentives is exactly what the VA employees did when they fudged the data.
The incentives have to be structured well.
Well, I guess we'll have to re-overhaul the entire tax system.
I think so.
Piece of cake, right? All right.
There we agree.
Thanks. Thanks. Okay, the third quick hit. I'll give you the real short version question first. Why have there been no CEOs or other senior executives sent to jail for the crimes that we all know were committed at some level or another during the financial crisis? Instead, there's been $76 billion worth of settlements among the top 5 of these banks. So why are these guys and gals not going to jail? John?
Few quick answers. First of all, the politics and the cronyism of it is preventing the Justice Department, which has currently an egregious record of trial advocacy, of taking action. Cronyism plugs in when you've got personal, cultural, political, and financial ties between Wall Street and the Department of Justice. A lot of these people say they're going to go on and do good things, but most of them turn into hitting the cash register and cashing out by going to Wall Street.
George?
Yeah, it's a good question, a long answer, but I'll try and make it brief. Citizens United and this thing called collateral consequences and too big to fail has caused the government to be willing to negotiate settlements with multi-billion-dollar corporations who have in fact violated the law. A corporation is a person, which means they can go to court. But if they settle by admitting no wrongdoing, by definition, if there were no wrongdoing, nobody gets to go to jail.
Cindy?
Well, here we go again. What gets measured gets done. What gets rewarded gets repeated. The system doesn't work the same for all members of our society, our justice system, and the incentives are bizarre. The incentives we have, the fact that there's no punishment when there is clear criminal activity sends the wrong message.
Amen.
I would add that the bipartisan nature of political contributions is amazing from the financial sector. So they manage to, on the one hand, complain about anti-business rhetoric, but at the same time, they're paying off both Democrats and Republicans to go easy on them.
So let me ask you a question here. Do you think that if the Justice Department could, in fact, make a case against Jamie Dimon, they would not do it?
I believe that's the case. That's right. Those are complex cases, and they are hard to make, and it's hard to find intent, but you can always come up with some charge.
Well, I'm not a lawyer, obviously, but I wonder if incarceration has made an impact on some of the CEOs that were incarcerated, like Joe Naccio, who is leaving or has just left.
Has just left, so we'll find out if it had any
and
effect.
has already indicated that he's going to be suing to get some of his funds back. Yeah. So, putting people in jail may not be an appropriate punishment anyway.
I do not think they would, because there's a precedent that's been set with respect to how the federal government goes about the process of prosecuting wrongdoing at the corporate level. There are 13,000 lobbyists in Washington today who have been paid $3.3 billion to make sure it doesn't happen.
Yeah. Well, let me weigh in on this a little bit, because I think I kind of sort of agree with all of you. So I think in order to try to make that case, it would take years and years and years and years and cost everybody tons and tons and tons of money. On the other hand, you can get a quick 76 billion bucks and get on to the next one, and you can put a check in your conviction rate column. So,
Well, I think, Dan, in response to that, this is an ethics panel, fundamentally. What does that say about the value of ethics in the process of business? Expediency seems to have taken a front seat, and the ethical issues surrounding whether or not a company can buy itself out of a problem has taken a backseat.
yep.
But this has been the case, you remember when the Environmental Protection Act was first enacted, the fines levied against companies for failure to comply with the law were considerably less than the amount of money it took to comply with the law. And so, once again, the reward system is not correctly set to produce the kind of behavior you really want to see happen.
I think the fines and the settlements have ramped up considerably, but I do think you're right that the pinch is not great enough. One of the primary ethical virtues is that of courage. And I don't think the Department of Justice has shown much courage in going after any of these people. They cower under the threat of having to go up against hugely paid corporate counsel. I'm reminded David Boies, who defended IBM for 13 years and always won against the Department of Justice, to the extent that they wound up hiring him to go after Microsoft. And now who is he representing but the CEO of AIG, Mr. Greenberg, in suing the government on the bailout issue. So the high-priced corporate attorneys, I think when you compare them to the talent in the SEC and the Department of Justice, the Department of Justice realizes if they go to court, they're probably going to lose.
Yeah, I've heard that, but I won't say from whom. Thank you very much. We'll call it quits there. Well, that was a very interesting set of conversations. We covered a lot of territory, all the way from General Motors to the Veterans Administration to the National Football League to financial crimes and a bunch of items in between. It seems to me that there are some common themes that we can pull from those conversations. One is certainly the issue and the power of organizational culture as a determinant of the way people behave within those organizations. Another is the danger of using metrics without due concern for the unintended consequences of that metric management, especially when it's connected with incentive performance systems. A third issue is the risks that are involved in trying to manage a large, complicated bureaucracy, especially one that has very little ability to change the personnel and the structures within it. We learned a lot about the need for organizational courage, the willingness and ability of people within an organization to, as they say, speak truth to power and carry bad news upstairs. So there's a lot of lessons here, and these are all important in terms of bringing ethics to our own enterprises. We will continue to explore these issues and many more as we cover additional topics as we bring you more quarterly ethics reviews.